it was like a $1.2 million mistake.
Oof, wow.
And so he approaches her and like, she just feels horrible. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get fired for sure. And so he approaches her and he's like, what do you think I should do? And she's like, I guess you should fire me. And he's like, why would I fire you? He's like, you just got a $1.2 million training lesson.
Wow.
You have to recognize that mistakes need to be made.
Mm-hmm.
Not that mistakes might be made, but that mistakes need to be made. And those mistakes are part of the process. Yeah.
You're listening to A Real Human Being, a podcast about conversation and connection and being human. My name is Josh Putnam, and I believe that everybody is worth listening to. That connection is powerful and healing, and that we need each other. Hello, everyone. Welcome into the show today. I have a great guest for you today. For me, excited to talk to this wonderful young lad. That was a strange way to start. But this is Weston he's the CEO of COMV Productions, and Weston and I know each other fairly well. We've worked together for some time now, and not in the but we have, I suppose, a mutual client, I guess is what we'd say now.
Yeah.
And so we worked closely together, and it's been a blast for me, and I've learned a ton from him. And so I'm excited to have him on today and talk about just stuff about what he does and his journey and kind of what brought him here. So Weston, welcome.
Excited to be here. Hey, thanks, man.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So let's maybe start with, we can talk about a little bit about COMV, like what you do now. So why don't you kind of just introduce COMV and your whole thing?
Yeah, so COMV Productions, the company that I own, is a film production company. We specialize in kind of two different elements. One element are commercials, and the other element is feature films. But in the end, the goal behind all of it is to inspire action. So we help clients bring to life, oftentimes like very difficult to explain subjects, in a way that is simplified and inspires their audience to action. And then on the film side, we tell stories that we hope inspire people to positive actions, to be able to, learn something about life through the both good and bad, portrayals of people's stories.
Yeah, the stories. Yeah, I mean, we're storytellers and story hearers. I guess we love a story.
Yeah.
So how long have you guys been around? How long have you been doing this, I guess?
Yeah. So, I mean, for myself, I created COMV when I was 12, but just kind of like as a kid, coming up with names and stuff. And it originally stood for computerized vehicles. So like I wanted to make cars, right? And that's where COMV as a name came. And then over the years, got into film production, really heavily when I was in high school, just because of some friends that were doing it. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And even before then, I was kind of doing film stuff. So kind of like all my life, I've been doing film related things. Like I don't remember how old I was, but it must have been like 7 or 8. But I remember as a kid, I would build like cameras out of cardboard. And I'd have like a shoulder rig camera, and I'd go around like pretending like I was filming people.
That's awesome.
And so that was kind of where the passion for filmmaking and telling people stories came from. And then COMV, came kind of when I was around 12. And then it wasn't really until 2011 that COMV became an official film production company.
Okay.
And so we've kind of been going strong since 2011.
Awesome. Yeah, that kind of leads into another question I had, because I was, so I've known you for a number of years now.
A number of years, yeah.
Because through our mutual friend, Jason, and I was always under the impression that you went to school for film, but he told me fairly recently that you went to school for business. And
So I get asked that a lot, and I guess it's kind of the thought of like, oh, if you're really good at something, maybe you went to school for it,
right? Which is kind of silly, right? Like, why does that
maybe?
well, I mean, but
Yeah.
I guess it's just a limited kind of perspective. Doesn't,
Yeah. Hmm.
you know,
Yeah. So I looked into school for film and was kind of disappointed by the options that I found. I went
mm,
to a number of schools,
mm-hmm,
showed them the stuff that I did in high school, and the program leaders were like, "Wow, this is amazing." In some cases, they're like, "Wow, this is as good, if not better, than some of our graduates."
right.
And I was like, "Okay, cool. Does that mean I get to get in?" And they're like, "No, you still have to go through the application process, and you still have to go through 2 years of generals and all this
Uh,
stuff." And it was like,
yeah.
"What's the point?" And so I kind of was discouraged.
Mm,
And then had seen a movie, Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, with Shia LaBeouf.
uh-huh.
And through that, kind of realized that the business world could eat you alive if you didn't know how to
Yeah.
handle yourself in it. And was like,
Yeah.
okay, I understand how to do the show part of show business, but
Uh,
not the business part. And so then I went and
interesting.
studied entrepreneurship.
Right. And that's obviously served you well as you're now a business owner and have to handle all kinds of,
Yes, yes, it served us very well in terms of, I think the only reason why we've been able to last 10 years as a company is because of that.
mm,
In our time, we've known lots of other film production companies who, in some cases maybe were more talented than us, and they,
sure.
fell off the face of the earth because they were purely just good at the film production part, not at the business part.
Right. Well,
Um, yeah, go ahead.
and that, well, that, I mean, I'm one of those, right? So like, because I, we've talked about, produced a film a few years ago, close to
Yeah, a
10
feature
years ago
film.
now.
Yeah.
Yeah, a feature. And I was realized and learned through that experience more. The biggest lesson I learned was I'm not a businessman. And I
Mm,
don't, not that I couldn't perhaps learn it, but I didn't
yeah.
know it then. And it
Yeah.
definitely ate me alive. It ate us alive. And we had a lot of major issues because of that side of it, where it was like, we
Hmm.
just didn't know how to handle business related things or organization
Yeah.
related things. It was
And I mean,
it was hard.
it's just so many things that I know for myself, even, first getting into just things that I overlooked, and partly to a degree, I kind of loathed. Like, I didn't
Mm-hmm.
like it. I remember thinking like, oh, I hate business.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until like we got a few years into it and we realized how much fun, like, I mean, really in the end, it's like when a business is run correctly, you'll still always have problems,
Mm-hmm.
but they're much more manageable and less stressful.
Mm,
And so it's like once we got the systems in place and once we, figured out pricing and once we figured out contracts, it's like,
mm-hmm.
in our first few years, we had clients who just straight up stole video content from us, right?
Wow. Yeah.
And, we have a finished product and we're like, hey, pay us for it. And they're like, no, we're not going to pay you for it, but we're going to use it. And
Wow.
it's like that was not fun. And
Right.
it's like
Right.
now that we have systems in place to where when we finish a project, we've had it where, I mean, just recently, because of some of the stuff with COVID, we had a client who couldn't pay the last part of the production cost.
Mm,
And we have a contract that said, this is what happens if that can't be completed.
mm-hmm.
And it just made the process so simple because it was like, oh, this is how much you owe on it. Oh, sorry, we can't pay that because of COVID and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, then it's like, okay, cool. So this and this and this is our property now. And, that's just the rights of it.
Right.
And
So
it's
it was
like,
all spelled out
there's,
already. You had a
yep,
contingency
all spelled
plan.
out. Yeah, but it wasn't even like nerve wracking for us because it wasn't
Right.
like, oh, yeah. It was just like, well, as per the contract,
Right.
such and such, like, hey, sorry to hear that. We understand things are rough,
Right.
but as per the contract, this is what you signed.
Yeah.
And that was it. Right.
Yeah. Makes it a lot simpler. I think that for us, in our experience, the emotion of the
Of
environment and the
pricing.
experience,
Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
ended up taking on it took over, right? It took
Yeah.
over everything.
Hmm.
And so I think having a plan in place, having the contracts laid out and all the agreements signed, and exactly what's going on, and everyone has agreed to it in
Hmm.
writing, and it does definitely make things, or would have certainly made things a lot
Yeah.
simpler for us.
Yeah. I mean, you had mentioned that even some of the relationships that you had when you were doing your
Mm-hmm.
feature film now are, maybe not necessarily broken, but you're not
At
as
least
close.
strained. Yeah.
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 And that was, I had an experience with our, currently our curriculum director. We have a film course segment of our company,
Mhm.
and Shane, our curriculum director, who at the time was our vice president, this was like a few years into the business, and I needed some help with rent.
Mm.
And so I'd reach out to him and I said, hey, could I borrow $150 from you just so I can make rent?
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, yeah, I'd love to help. And he sent me a contract. I
Mm.
remember at first I was like, it's like, geez, like, don't you trust me?
Right.
But then I realized as I, read through the contract, it's like the point of the contract was because he trusted me and also because he valued me as a friend, he didn't want
Right.
money to get in the way of that friendship.
Right.
And that was the first moment when it was like, oh, wow, like contracts aren't about like
Being impersonal
taking it
or
or yeah, being impersonal or taking advantage of the other party.
right.
I mean, some contracts probably do, but
Mhm.
that's not their main intent. The intent
Right.
is to actually keep those relationships positive by clearly outlining, here's what you agreed to,
Yeah.
here's kind of the result, and then if you don't complete with it, here's the consequence.
Right. Setting an expectation.
Yeah.
Jason talks about that a lot in
Hmm.
relationship building, setting your expectations
Yeah.
and then either, meeting them or exceeding them. But
Yeah.
you're aware of what the expectation is. So you make the agreement beforehand
Yep.
and promise
Hmm. Yeah,
to,
and it's like every time we ran into an issue with the client, we add a segment to the contract for the
mm,
next client, and it's like, okay, that was an issue,
mm-hmm,
and so now our contracts, when someone gets them, it has kind of the vision of like, here's the audience we're marketing to, here's what we're trying to accomplish with it, and all this stuff, because
mm,
we even have it where clients come back and they're like, oh, why'd you do this and this and this? We were targeting males. And it's like, well, no, as per our agreement and what we originally talked about, your
mm,
audience was females. And so it's,
mm-hmm,
it's like, so it's all outlined. And then we have the inclusions in terms of, how many cameras are supposed to be on set, how many days of shooting, how many minutes of editing, what's
mm-hmm,
included, music, graphics, that kind of stuff. And we just outline all of it.
mm-hmm.
And then we also started including in our contract the add-ons to where it's like, if you want an extra script or if you want an extra day of filming, this is how much it costs.
Ah, okay.
And it just makes it so easy to when a client comes in and says, hey, love what you guys are doing, let's do another day.
Yeah.
And whereas beforehand it'd be like, yeah, that's supposed to cost more money. And what, it's supposed to cost more money?
Right.
Now it can be like, oh, we would love to do that for you.
Yeah.
As per the agreement, it is so many thousands of dollars extra per day.
Right.
And then like they can't argue.
Right. Exactly. So it's all, yeah, we definitely needed that. but you got, I mean, as it sounds like you kind of, I think you probably had a bit of a, not a head start. I mean, you gave yourself that head start, but you had a bit of an advantage than over what we did, but you did, it sounds like you did learn a lot by
Oh
kind of
yeah,
trial and
yeah. I
error as
mean,
well.
I think the advantage that we had was going to school, which helped a lot.
Yeah.
And not really because of school, because of the people we met there. I
Right.
was
The
fortunate to go
connections.
to I was fortunate to go to a college that was a college, not a university.
Mm-hmm.
And what was cool about this particular college is it was very small, and almost all the teachers in my entrepreneurship courses were adjunct, so they only worked part-time. And it
Okay.
was awesome because they would come back from, one of our teachers came back and is like, hey, I just sold my business for $600 million. Let's talk about that. And it's
Wow.
like, oh, okay.
So they had
So
real world experience.
yeah, real world. I mean, these weren't
Yeah.
like professors that had been,
10
teaching
years.
business for the past 20 years. And it's
Yeah.
like they owned a business 30 years ago. And it's like
Right.
the business environment is so different now.
Right.
These were guys who just got off from, doing their entrepreneurship stuff. And, we had one sales teacher who was like, okay, guys, I got to do a sales call to, this big corporation. Everybody be quiet and I'll put them on speakerphone.
Oh, wow.
And so he runs through the whole thing. He, runs into the gatekeeper and builds rapport with the person, and then,
Yeah.
goes through and kind of works his way into talking with the guy who he needs to talk to.
Yeah.
And so, that was some advantage that we had. But honestly, like the second part that I don't know if it's really an advantage, it's just kind of more of the mindset of we just kept, making mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just kept running into business, and we would do a client, and then, they'd find some way to take advantage of us. And it's like, okay, we got to put that in the contract. And so it's like, we just kept going through. Now, COMV's done thousands of videos, and we've worked with, it's like 150 plus clients right now. And, it's like, a percentage of those clients were clients that we'll probably never work with again.
Mm-hmm.
But we learned through all those experiences how to basically, every time a mistake happened, instead of being like, oh man, like what's wrong with everybody, we would internalize and be like, oh, cool, what could we do next to prevent that? And then, we just kept developing this really succinct agreement that now protects us. And it's like, over the past 4 years, when problems have come up, our contract has been there to back us up. And it's just made things super simple and has really taken the emotion out of stuff.
Right.
And in some cases, it saved the client relationship. In some cases, the client probably wasn't going to do a video with us again anyways, but they don't feel like they were taken advantage of. They just were like, oh, I didn't
realize.
I guess I should have read it.
Right.
Before I signed it.
And that's kind of an element of our sort of world condition now, where there's so many contracts and so many things that we don't always, plus like contract language is often
and for us, we try to make it like our contract is 3 pages. And we spend a lot of time designing it graphically, so it is appealing and it is well organized.
That's good.
So it's like we don't want to hide anything from you, because that creates more issues. We want, and when we do the email, when we send over the contract, it's like, hey, make sure you check out section such and such. That includes what is being paid for. In section such and such, you can see how much additional stuff costs if you add on to it. And so it's like we try to draw their attention to it. So we avoid those issues of people feeling like, oh, I guess I should have read it. But even still, then people just don't read it.
Yeah, it's true. But that's something that I think that you kind of have pulled from your creative side and your sort of analytical side, where you do. That's always impressed me about you, is that you have great organizational skills, but you do have an eye for kind of the the beauty of
like
things
artistry
as well.
Or creativity.
Yeah.
It's definitely kind of in the middle. So I'm a director, and the thing that I always tell to people who want to be directors is like, I believe a director is kind of good at a lot of things, but not exceptionally good at anything. So I'm just kind of the jack of all trades, which helps me guide other people to be profound at what they're doing. And I can hold the vision and kind of put it all together. But so with that, I kind of have like this 2 worlds of I'm kind of a leader and a vision person in that regard, but I have enough creativity to where I can make a decision on that graphic design looks good or bad, or that lighting looks good or bad. It's like, obviously a designer will do much better job than me, or the lighting person will do a much better job than me doing it alone.
Right.
But that kind of balance between the analytical and the artistic side gives us some benefit.
And it needs to, and I think that's it allows you to be able to make connections in ways that maybe if you did if you were focused on one of those aspects, you might not be able to.
Yeah, and it gives me understanding, which can be a benefit or a disadvantage. Like, I think it's easier to ask someone to do something when I know what I'm actually asking. It's like, when I send someone a website design thing, I'm not just like, hey, do this, and I don't even know, how difficult it is. I can, I can, sympathize or empathize. I don't remember which one.
I get them mixed up a little bit as well. I think Brene Brown defines empathy as feeling with somebody.
Okay, so
Whereas
I can
sympathy is,
empathize with them
yeah, yeah,
that, hey, I know this is a really difficult task, but I also know that you can do it, right? So it's like
yeah,
I feel like because most of the people that I work with know that if I didn't ask them to do it, I would do it.
hmm
That it kind of gives them a little bit more, hopefully, encouragement that they're being trusted with it.
hmm
But at the same time, I can be pretty nitpicky with stuff because I can
right.
also still do it,
So that's
just not as well.
right, but that is actually a challenge that I think some, because I'm similar to you in that I often think of myself as like, man, I'm like a maybe above, I wouldn't say, I don't know if above
Yeah, like
average,
above average.
but just because the average person doesn't know that much about a lot of things, but like above average at a lot of things and really good at nothing. Like,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like when it's like, I mean, I think
Which,
there probably are some things, but like, but a lot of that has come from like when we did our film, like we didn't have any money, so it was like
mhm.
I had to do stuff.
Yeah, but it's also kind of the personality because it's
Yeah,
like, you had to do stuff, but also other people had to do stuff, but they
yeah,
didn't, right? So
right.
it's like there's that leadership element. And, that's what makes a great director, I
Mm-hmm.
believe, to where, um, you have a natural drive for learning,
Mm-hmm.
which will propel you to learn a more than normal amount about a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the same time, the hardest part, I know for me, delegation was always and still kind of is the hardest thing for me
Mm-hmm.
to deal with.
Right.
Because if I just grab anybody off the street and hire them to do something, I can still do a better job than them, even if that's their
Right.
specialty.
Yeah.
But then I have to work with them to where they kind of learn the mindset of kind of the way I approach stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and then they can excel more than me.
Mm-hmm. Kind of
So
give
it's
them a
like,
framework.
yeah, yeah, give them that framework, and then it's like once you let them go, like they do a great job. I think a great example is, for the people watching, Josh and I work with a client who does this podcast, and
Mm-hmm.
it's like so our team first did the podcast, and then we brought Josh on to help edit it and
Mm-hmm.
kind of take over from our editing team, and then you took over the thumbnails and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And now when I watch the podcast now, since our team's completely removed from it, um, there's elements of what we had taught you in that,
Mm-hmm.
but you now have, you have far exceeded what we originally had. Like your
Mm-hmm.
thumbnails look so much better now. Like, the in cards and intro cards, like you've taken your own talent and put it into it and made it something bigger.
Well, I
And
appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you.
yeah, and I think that's a great example of, it's like you give that foundation and you give some time,
Mm-hmm.
and then once you establish that foundation of kind of like the minimum expectation of quality,
Mm-hmm.
um, a talented person given authority will then be like, oh, cool, if that's the minimum, I can do a little bit more, and then they do.
Right. And it's like, and I think that actually fits very well with what Garrett does.
Hmm.
Garrett being the guy that we're
Mutually
editing
work
for.
with,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, uh, is his business kind of philosophy is like, and he's talked about his journey that he had to learn this, but it was like,
Hmm.
let people take ownership of, like, inspire them and empower them to take ownership of their role rather than
Yeah,
delegating
their
everything or
tasks.
micromanaging
Hmm.
everything and
Yeah.
saying, because then now you do run into the possibility of them not growing that role or not taking it, you know or maybe the talent level not being there or the drive not being there,
Hmm.
so maybe it won't improve, but then that's I guess a different conversation. But a lot of the time when people are given the trust and the opportunity and the tools and the support and whatever they might need, but it is that kind of that, I think it's the trust, but it's like it just feels inspiring, right? You feel like, well, they think that I'm capable of doing this. I remember when I first came in um, and started working, and you were showing me the ropes. My
Hmm.
first day or two, I was like, can I can I even do this? Like, I like you know, I mean, I had a skill set, but it wasn't as advanced as it is now. And it wasn't, um, and a lot of that was a lack of my own confidence and stuff like that. But I think having, you were always willing and 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 gracious, or willing to show that encouragement, and there were a couple things that I needed, you know, input on, or to make some adjustments here and there. But for the most part, and even when you had to do that, it was always encouraging. And I think that there's that's kind of a skill as well, to learn how to give correction or improve, but to do it in a positive or encouraging way.
Yeah. And it's like with delegation, like patience is really important. And that's what I notice a lot of. Like, I've had a few of our employees get hired out for like other people. And they're like, hey, do you know any editors? Because, like, you know, they can't afford the cost of what our production's currently at. So like, hey, you know, I can't afford you guys, but maybe I could use one of your editors. It's like, yeah, sure, you can hire one of our editors on the side. And what I've noticed is most of the time, these are people who, like, they do everything, right? And they're just so busy with the stuff that they do that they're like, oh, I have to get an editor so I can, like, relieve some pressure.
Right.
So then they reach out and they're like, hey, like, you know, COMV, you guys have really phenomenal videos. Let me borrow one of your editors. It's like, okay, yeah, you can borrow them. And what I've noticed, usually what happens is they give our editor a try, and then, like, the first video is not what they were expecting. And then they're like, oh, no, I'll just do it myself.
Right.
Instead of, and it's like, it's this process. I find that for me, I've always told myself delegation is a process. It takes time to be able to establish, you know, what that quality baseline is. Every production is different. Every system's going to be different. And it's like, you know, if I'm the authority figure, I usually, and this may be wrong, but it's worked for me, I usually do, like, the first, you know, if we're getting hired to do a series of videos, I'll do the first one myself so I can get kind of the vision of, like, what I want it to be and use that as a template. And then I teach that to the team and let them replicate it. Depending on what it is. Like, that's probably for more corporate stuff. For commercial stuff, or sorry, for creative stuff where we're, like, working on a film or something, I don't do that because, you know, I want my team to fully take charge of the creativity.
Right.
But, you know, it just kind of depends a bit. But if probably the best way to put it is, if you're doing something that has repetitious, I don't know, repeatability. If you have something that's like a project base, it's repeatability. You know, you do a podcast and they're always the same podcast, or you're doing a client video for dentists and it's always, you know, the same kind of story and you're just repeating it. That type of delegation takes a template, which is kind of your standardization of quality.
Yeah.
And then it takes multiple training sessions that you have to recognize that mistakes need to be made. Not that mistakes might be made, but that mistakes need to be made. And those mistakes are part of the process. Yeah. Because it's like, the more that you make a mistake, the less likely you're to do it. One of the great examples that I heard from one of our entrepreneurship teachers, he was talking about early on in his career, actually it was a client that we had worked for. He was talking about, he had this big printing press and he had hired this woman to come help him with the printing press. And she made a mistake that that destroyed one of the rollers on their printer and backed up their, like, you know, killed a whole bunch of orders, and they were backed up for like 2 or 3 days.
Wow.
It was, you know, like, it was like a $1.2 million mistake.
Oof. Wow.
And so he approaches her and, like, you know, she just feels horrible. And she's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get fired for sure. And so he approaches her and he's like, what do you think I should do? And she's like, I guess you should fire me. And he's like, why would I fire you? He's like, you just got a $1.2 million training lesson.
Wow.
He's like, do you think you will ever make the mistake again? She was like, no. And he's like, good, because I don't think you'll ever make it again. So it's like, why would I fire you if if I just paid $1.2 million to train you on a really important lesson?
Right.
And that, I think, you know, was a really big insight for me, where it was like, oh yeah, like mistakes, you know, if you can bring up mistakes and failures, which is part of life, in a way that's like, hey, like, no worries, let's look at what you did, let's look at what the result was, and let's look at why that isn't the desirable result.
Right.
And then most people won't ever make those mistakes again.
That's interesting. What a great way to look at it, because you're right. Mistakes are inevitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had never really thought of it
And
as,
necessary.
that's what I was
I
going to
would
say.
think, yeah.
I'd never thought of it that way, as like taking it a step further. You need them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really like the point of business, the point of my employees is I find ways for them to make failures early and
Mm,
often so
mm,
we can learn from them. And by the time it gets to the point where it matters, we're not making those mistakes. I mean, this
mm,
even goes back to the way that we do film production. We do something that we call live action storyboarding.
mm-hmm,
We also call it shot blocking,
mm-hmm.
where we will either a commercial or a film, we'll shoot the whole thing, just in our backyard.
Yeah,
And so it's like we've got the shot list, we've got people who are standing in for the actors, and we
yeah,
run through every single shot and we edit it together and we see how does it flow, how does it work, and through that process we make hundreds and hundreds of little failures,
yeah,
right? To where it's like, oh, this shot doesn't edit together like we thought it would, or oh, this scene is just pointless, and so we take it
yeah.
out and we get a sense for what worked and what didn't work,
Mm-hmm,
and then we edit it together. And sometimes we do even like a second version of our live action storyboarding. We do a
uh-huh,
round two. We correct those mistakes and see, okay, does it flow much better? Sometimes we'll set up the actual equipment we're going to film with, so the team's rehearsed on, okay, how can we set this up quickly?
mm-hmm.
Because those mistakes are cheap.
Right.
They're just in our
Yeah.
backyard. If we make a massive mistake, if we film the wrong thing, or if the line was said wrong, or they didn't cut together, it's like, okay, what? It's a few $100, maybe a thousand or so dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Versus when we're on set, if those
Yeah.
mistakes are made, now we're looking at, five, 10, $20,000 going to waste
Right.
with those mistakes.
Yeah. That's interesting. So, I mean, I was there for one of your, when Jason was doing his short, and
Oh yeah, his short
we
film.
shot blocked that one, and I had we didn't shot block anything because we were so new and
Yeah.
green at everything, um, but I hadn't heard it kind of the full, you know, or thought about the full ramifications of doing something like that, where
Mhm.
you're essentially doing a dry run. Yeah, it might take a lot of time, and it might take a lot of energy,
And
and
it costs something, right?
right, because
It
you're
takes time
still
and money.
have your employees and your money, yeah, and your time is being used. But um, how beneficial that would be in the
Hmm.
end to the final product, where you've kind of worked out a lot of your kinks. I'm sure that there are still things that come
Oh
up
yeah,
on,
there's always new
you
new
know,
kings,
but well, one of
but
the things,
they're not detrimental to the project
right,
anymore. They're like small ones, like, oh, the sun's a little different than what we planned
right,
for, or like, oh, this light, um, doesn't fit where we thought it would because there's a bookshelf there and it'd be
hmm,
really impossible to move the bookshelf. But
yeah,
even, that stuff, when we hit those mistakes on set, we try to think, okay, how could we have planned that even better? Like,
yeah,
okay, let's make sure we map the sun correctly and stuff.
and it's
What were
that
you going to say?
it's that growth mindset. Um,
Hmm.
well, no, I was just gonna, like, one of the things you do is that there is, like, I mean, you really block it out. So like when we were there, we had a big open space,
Hmm.
and I mean, you used physical objects to map out the exact,
Hmm.
dimensions of your location. And so it wasn't just like here's kind of a general idea of what we might be. I mean, it
Hmm.
was like basically exactly what it was gonna,
Yeah.
kind of your dimensions, your clearance, your everything was kind of taken into account, and so you're
Hmm.
able to get a pretty darn good accurate
Yeah.
idea of what you're going to be running into.
Yeah. And it, again, it's like it costs some money, but the amount of money that we save in terms of getting it right when we're
Mm-hmm.
paying for actors and makeup and
Mm-hmm.
location and all that stuff, just it's worth the savings basically.
Yeah.
And also, that's when we tell a lot of people about live action storyboarding and shot blocking, and most people are like, oh, that doesn't seem necessary. And I understand like the thought
Right.
process, because for us, like, it didn't seem necessary when we first started it.
Mm-hmm.
um it it we had a few productions that kind of fumbled together,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like, we were hours behind, and just kind
Mm-hmm.
of the typical thing
Yeah.
when I talk to most film production people, they're like, oh yeah, we're only 3 hours behind, we're doing pretty good.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
like, after we learned how to do shot blocking, we've never had a day where we ran behind.
Wow.
um, because one, when we do the test, we're taking calculations of, okay, this shot took so long, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now we have formulas to where we are breaking down the duration on a per shot basis. Like, it's going to take 30 minutes to get shot 3.4, and
Uh-huh.
it's going to take 15 minutes to get shot 3.6. And it's like,
Wow.
we're breaking down on that per minute basis. And that way, when we are, renting the location, we know exactly how long we need it.
Yeah.
And we give ourselves a little buffer, and we always finish on time to the dot, or usually, 30 minutes. I mean, we had one shoot where we finished like an hour and a half early.
Wow.
Um, and it's like, okay, cool. Now we have time to shoot a few extra shots that we weren't
Yeah.
even planning on, just because we still have the location.
Wow.
Versus the opposite, where it's like, oh, we're an hour and a half behind,
Right.
and now we have to remove two shots that we were planning on getting, but maybe they weren't that important.
Right. Yeah. That, and I mean, that's like you're the polar opposite of what ours was like, where it was
Mm-hmm.
just like we schedule the location, and then we're hour
Figuring
to
out.
3 hours late, and they're like expecting us, and part of the crew's there, and some of them aren't, and then there's traffic, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's whatever, and so it was like, I remember one of the locations, like, they were not happy, understandably.
Yeah.
They were not happy about how, I mean, we were cutting into their bit, like we were using a location that was open for business. It wasn't
Oh,
like,
yeah.
we had rented out the whole thing. So it was like, he was like, we've got to just keep going with our day. So, like, we're not gonna
We're not
work.
gonna wait for you.
Right. Yeah. So we ended up
Yeah.
kind of filming in the middle of there. So audio was bad, and it
Yeah.
just, but so I could definitely see the value of organizing it that way. And so, do you
Yeah.
have somebody on
Oh, go ahead.
kind of that practice set, taking notes of time and everything, how you do that?
So we don't have. So usually our first assistant camera, first AC, will be taking some notes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not really like one person is taking note. It's kind of everybody in their department is taking notes.
Okay.
So it's like, our cinematographer, he's taking note of, oh, that lens didn't work. And so,
Mm-hmm.
he's making notes on that. And, the first AC is like, oh, this is what our setup and takedown time is. And as a
Mm-hmm.
director, I'm taking, my own notes of, oh, make sure that, if he lifts up his right arm or his left arm, make sure in the next shot that we have those continuities synced. And so it's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm making little notes throughout the whole process, and everybody's making notes.
Yeah.
And then we come together with what we call a director's meeting, where we have our director, myself, director of photography, our art director, and then sometimes like our post supervisor director for editing.
Mm-hmm.
We all come together and we make those notes together,
Okay.
to make sure that basically all the notes that everybody got from the live action storyboarding come together.
Mm-hmm. That's good. Yeah. That,
Yeah.
I mean,
And
go ahead.
I was just going to say, kind of going back to what you're talking about with, like, being late and stuff like that. It's like, we've all made those mistakes.
Right.
That's where we learned what it was.
Yeah.
And we just started making rules for ourselves, where it's like, okay, if there's more than 5 people coming to a shoot, everybody has to be there. Like the call time is at least, or if there's more than 5 people, the call time is an hour away from when we actually have to start rolling.
Prior to.
Yeah, prior to.
Okay.
And then it's like, if we have more than 10 people, we give ourselves more time, where we'll create kind of like an artificial call time. And then it's like, we create a 30-minute buffer on top of that, to where it's like, we're telling you to come at 9:30. We know that everybody will eventually arrive by 10 o'clock. So the actual call time is 10 o'clock, but the communicated call time is 9:30.
Okay. Gotcha.
And it's like, we just kind of created rules for ourselves,
yeah.
that help us kind of manage, people and schedules, and, issues that always arise with traffic, or people run out of gas and stuff like that.
Yeah, we ran out of gas one time on our way down to, we were shooting down in Mapleton, which is,
Oh yeah,
for those who don't know, we're both here in Utah, so it was like an hour and a half away from
Jeez.
where I am,
Hmm.
and we ran out of gas on the freeway. And we were really close to the exits. We were able to just pull off
Push it.
and get, well, we just, there was a gas station like within a mile off of the freeway.
Oh, okay.
So we just went and walked to it and bought a gas can and filled it
Oh,
up
and
and put enough gas in that we could
oh
get it to the
man.
location. I mean, yeah, it was,
Yeah, and it's like, errors happen like that. I mean,
yeah.
even despite all the planning that we have, like we still run into some big ones on
Hmm.
occasion. But the idea is that we go into a project knowing that we have to make failures. And
Hmm.
so I just tell people to ask yourself, like, okay, when do you want to make this failure? Do you want to make it while the client's on set or before the client's on set?
Hmm.
And it's like, you're going to have to make the failure anyways.
Right.
So it's like, let's figure it out. Because, I mean, with all failures, you don't know what the failure is going to be.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so, we
It's sort
shoot.
of part of the thing.
Hmm.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, that's really interesting because like I think it kind of speaks to that whole, you've got that growth mindset versus fixed mindset, where
Mm.
you, and I've struggled to kind of break out of that fixed mindset where it's like this is how it has to be and there's no adjustment there.
Mm.
But when
Yeah.
you can learn how to adjust and how to see things as um, not just not just okay, but even valuable,
Hmm.
um, that I think that your sort of longevity and success, has speaks to the benefits of that, of being able to just say, okay, this is not the end of the world. In fact, it's probably a good thing, and let's
It's probably the
find
beginning of something much better.
the value. Yeah. So how long did it take you to kind of develop that, or have you always kind of been blessed with that ability?
Oh, to develop the ability?
Yeah.
Hmm. That's a good question. I mean, I definitely think like the way in which I was raised
Hmm.
and, the people I was around, they're just, in some of my own like strengths inherently, I tend to lean more towards possibilities.
Hmm.
Um, and that, um, I don't know, just like failure was never a big thing. And I think part of that comes from like, discipline from my parents, where it's like I never got punished for making a mistake.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that plays a lot into it, which is hard because it's like,
Hmm.
man, some people, even in our company, they grew up and every mistake they made, they were punished for. And so
Hmm.
it's like, you get so fearful of making mistakes,
Right.
and it's really hard to psychologically change that.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's benefit for myself in that of, I was raised with parents who, they didn't, punish me for every single mistake.
Hmm.
Um, and there was a lot of like, creativity more or less. I mean, my dad built, large portion of the house that we lived in, and it's like, I helped him with that, and it's like through that I realized there was a lot of mistakes, and I would say my dad didn't always handle them with like positivity and didn't embrace them with like, oh, look, a mistake.
Yeah.
But I think for myself, I observed that sometimes he would hit a mistake and he would get frustrated with the mistake, and that it made it harder to find the solution. And so I think
Mm.
through that observation, for
Okay.
myself, I learned like, okay, you know, don't let myself get frustrated because it impedes my ability to learn from it.
Right.
And so I had some ability for introspection, which
Hmm.
again, I think introspection was part of my upbringing. But it helped me to be able to observe my surroundings, and even, my parents, who did a good job of teaching me, not punishing me for mistakes. I was also
Hmm.
able to learn from some of the negative ways that they would react to failures.
Hmm.
And I learned for myself to react kind of more positively to failures and try
Right.
to embrace it.
Yeah.
And then just kind of through trial and error, I realized that, here was a moment in my life when something bad happened and I dreaded it. And it's like that bad thing seemed to last so long,
Yeah.
versus another time in my life, a bad thing happened and I just said, okay, why is this happening? What do I need to learn from it? And
Hmm.
then it's like, it's gone. Right.
Interesting.
Like it just wasn't drug out for, months and months and months or whatever it was. It just was like, I learned what I need to learn. And it was like, oh, that's what I could learn. And then it's
Yeah.
like, move on.
That's
Um,
interesting because I think that I think I think that the thing that makes it difficult for people to do that
Hmm.
is a difficulty with processing the emotion of the experience.
Yeah,
So it
yeah,
feels like it's like
and
I'm not
I'm not a
allowed to do
very
that, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, I agree. And I'm not a very emotional person. And
Mm.
so, I mean, I think some people would compare me to Spock when it comes to like my emotions.
Uh-huh.
And so that's where I would say probably I have a little more ease at that because
Mm.
I'm very, I'm, for whatever reason, I don't quite know why I'm able to disconnect myself from,
Mm.
the emotion of stuff. If
Mhm.
like, if someone says, hey, Weston, you are a horrible person because of this and this and this, um, I mean, it still hurts because we're human beings, but it's like I
Mhm.
can disconnect myself and try to kind of focus on like, oh, why are they, saying this? Is it
Yeah.
valid? And it's like I start asking myself, like, okay, I kind of like put it into a bucket, and it's like, okay, this could be a valid critique of myself.
Uh-huh.
And then I go ask like three or four other people, and I've realized that, if one person alone says something that's wrong with you, then it could actually be something wrong with the person, right?
Right. Yeah.
If two people say the same thing are wrong with you, then it probably has more validity. If
Mhm.
three people say the same thing is wrong with you, then it's like, yeah, you're the one that's wrong, and you got to correct it.
Mhm.
And so it's like, so I'm able to compartmentalize it and put it in a bucket and say, cool, let me get more evidence
Yeah.
to back up this thought process. And
Yeah.
then, I go ask people that I know are trusted. I try to ask people that I know would be on opposite spectrums, so I'm not getting bias. And
Mhm.
then it's like, once I gather enough data, I can make a conclusion about, whether or not the feedback was correct. And now I need to find a way to address it, or, it was erroneous. And now I need to kind of figure out what in that person's life had them perceive the way I was doing something negatively.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that that's a very, well, a very uh, helpful or positive way to look at it, because we
Hmm.
all run into those experiences with
Yeah.
somebody, right? Where we're all criticized, or we're all,
Hmm.
somebody. I don't think there's anyone that's ever gone through life without
Being
being
criticized.
right, criticized or attacked
Yeah.
or yelled at or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
And often it is more about the other person than you, but sometimes
Hmm. Yeah,
there
sometimes it is you.
it could be yeah, it could be something that you need to correct, and that for me is a difficult thing, but I know how necessary it really is to to figure out, kind of going back to that growth mindset thing where you're like, okay,
Hmm.
but um I don't have to be disempowered by this. I don't have to be, that doesn't have to
Yeah.
ruin my life. It
But
doesn't have to.
instead, it could empower you.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It could be just a learning experience that could help me to grow in a way that I really should grow. And um, but I've discovered, for me, that's a challenge. But it's,
Yeah. Oh,
but I
yeah, it
recognize the
is.
need for it.
Yeah. Well, and there's three ways to approach it. I don't know the psychology behind developing how to approach it, but I've realized you can brush it off, which is one way. And
Hmm.
I find that tends to make arrogant people. It's just like, oh, I could care
Hmm.
less. Like who the F are you? I don't care kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And it's like, those people, probably no one's gonna like them anyways. But
Hmm.
what's kind of cool is it doesn't affect them. It just affects everybody else because they're like a storm going
Oblivious.
through the workplace.
Yeah.
Then the second way is the middle ground, which I believe is the introspective, where it's like it's valid or it's potentially valid. I think is the most
Hmm.
important part. So it's like you set that mindset, it's potentially valid, gather information.
Hmm.
And then the third way is, anything that someone says to you, it just completely destroys you. You take it for 100% fact. And,
Right.
it makes you kind of an emotional mess, unfortunately.
Right.
And it's like, I don't know the psychology between what sets up those three different realms. Um, but, I find it's beneficial to strive for the middle one of introspection, but it's,
Yeah.
easier said than done.
Right. And I think that, like, in all of my kind of research over the last number of years, I think it's
Hmm.
a lot of it, I think, is trauma based. So
Yes,
like we experience
especially
these,
childhood trauma.
yep, childhood traumas, and so it's not really like a logical you know, response. It's just
Hmm.
your physiologically, your body remembers something from the past, and
Yeah.
that is reminiscent of whatever.
And it triggers it.
Yeah, it triggers it, and so your body kind of just responds, and so it's not really a.
Hmm.
But there's ways to address that and to correct it and to
Hmm.
resolve it. I mean, I believe in those things very much. I've worked on it myself a lot, and I struggled to do it, but I do believe in the the possibility of being able
Yeah.
to resolve those
Hmm.
traumas and not have to go through your entire life like you know,
Just
constantly being
impacted by
triggered.
every little thing
Right.
that someone says to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in the hard part, I've known a number of people who struggle a lot with, very severe, PTSD or
Yeah.
depression. Um, and the moments that I've seen them, have the most power for themselves is when they were able to, in the moment, be like, tell me whatever you're going to tell me. I'm just going to write it down. Right.
Mm.
And they removed from themselves the need to process it in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And they communicated, the boundaries clearly, like, tell it to me, I'm going to go think about it. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like,
Interesting.
once they removed themselves from it, they were able to then, just write down that information. And then they went and, most likely cried about it, like,
Sure.
had to process this
Yeah.
very difficult stuff. But then they had it written down to where they could systematically go through it and hopefully, take the time and reach out to people they trusted and be like, hey, do I do such and such?
Yeah.
Okay. And then you find trusted people who, that's the hard part, is like, that's the
Yeah.
network part where,
Yeah.
I feel like I'm able to go through, these failures so quickly because
Mm-hmm.
I have surrounded myself with a lot of really honest and trusted people
Mm-hmm.
to where they're not going to skirt around issues because I'm their employer.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they're not afraid of that element because I'm not going to fire them because they tell me the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they're very truthful. And so, sometimes it may be a little hard for them to be like, yeah, Weston, like, since so-and-so brought it up, I agree. Sometimes you are very difficult with such and such.
Mm.
Or sometimes on set, I felt like, you didn't care about what I, was trying to do artistically. And so it's like, then it opens up conversation. And then we can solve those failures very quickly because
Mm-hmm.
I have that, resource to go to. And I think it's the hardest part for a lot of people is, it's like, once you get that technique, that's a hard part. If you can get the technique to
Yeah.
be able to separate yourself, write it down, and then go think about it and process it. The second hard part is who's that support group that you
Right.
have that's going to help you. Because I find most of the time we surround ourselves with people who tell us what we want to hear,
Right.
which is not beneficial. Because then it's like, oh, no, you're the best. Like, no,
Yeah.
he's just an idiot. Right. And
Right.
it's like, well, that doesn't help.
Right. I mean, it might be true, but
It could be true,
but
but most of the time it's not.
yeah.
In
But I
terms
mean,
of,
yeah, I think that like the balance, the hard part is finding the right people who are going to be, because I think that the emotion of it and is an important part or a big part of it. And so
mhm,
and I've found for myself, I need somebody, I'm okay with somebody telling me the truth. And if it's something I need to work on and need to improve on,
mhm,
I want to know so that I can
yeah,
get better, but I also need gentleness in it,
yeah,
in the conveying of it. Um,
yes,
so, which is fine, perfectly fine. But it's definitely a difficult skill for people to
yeah,
master,
and
to be
it takes a
gentle. But
lot of, and I don't know how much like humility plays into it.
yeah.
Um, I think sometimes in my mind I mistake trauma and lack of humility,
Mm, mm,
because I think sometimes trauma brings up a lack of humility because like you can become so damaged as a person.
mm-hmm.
It's like every little thing is always attacking you as an individual.
Right.
But it's like, that's what it is. Like, it's difficult. It's like, how do you, it's not
Right.
necessarily just becoming more humble is going to help
Right.
you,
Right. Oh,
because
I just need
sometimes
to.
becoming more humble, you're going to take more crap from people. And then that's, even worse.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah. you have to have, I think, I mean, you have to ultimately at some point have, develop a healthy, um, perspective or view of yourself and
Hmm.
reality, and
Yeah.
have a strong foundation for where your self-worth is coming from, so that you don't have to internalize everything that
Yeah.
everyone says or thinks about you, whether it's true or not,
Hmm.
because truthfully, I think, like, so I wrote this little book a couple of years ago, and,
Hmm.
called You Are Enough. And I've thought a lot about that concept, as I've heard some people talk about, like, recently came across kind of a video speaking against that concept of you are enough.
Oh,
That's kind of like,
interesting.
because it's kind of, it's kind of around in the zeitgeist, right? This idea you are enough. Everyone's kind of talking about that, or have been for the last couple of years. But I do see where they're coming from, in that, like, we sometimes then we become,
Complacent.
deaf to, yeah, or complacent,
Hmm.
deaf to ways that we might really, like, legitimate, um, uh, ways that we might need to correct ourselves, or
Yeah.
to improve. Because, like, especially if you're dealing with relationships with people, like,
Yeah.
it I think that there's incredible power in just unconditional love, but then there's also, it's very easy for that to turn into toxicity, and
Yeah.
for that to just be
Yeah.
like, I'm just taking on whatever you do or say is
Hmm.
okay.
And
So,
that's difficult because it's in my mind, it's like you are enough
mhm.
and you can improve.
Right,
But it's like
right,
if you're not in the right mental state, all you hear is and you can improve. And
right,
it's like, no, 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 like
right,
you are enough and I love you the way you are.
yeah,
But also, as much as I want to improve myself to make myself better for you, I would hope it's the same of you're improving yourself,
right,
um, so that you feel better about yourself. So you perform better in work. So you're a better spouse, or
yeah,
whatever it is.
yeah.
So yeah,
Well, and
it's a very difficult line.
yeah, definitely. And so, like, I'm careful now, or not careful, but, like, I'm intentional with what I say. Like, I
Yeah.
think people are enough for, like, grace, mercy,
Mm, smart.
acceptance,
Yeah.
love, but that doesn't mean that they are a finished product, or that there aren't ways in which they could or even need to
Mm,
improve.
yeah. Very
Um,
well stated.
because, like, there, like, it is a fine line, and you could just fall into, like, oh, I'm enough just to accept me as I am. I don't need to change, and the problem is always with you, and just there's no improvements that ever need to be made.
Mm,
And I don't think that that's necessarily true, but I also think that then, yeah, you can quickly slip into, well, I'm never good enough, I can't ever, I'm not good enough for
yeah.
that acceptance, or for that kindness, or for that, love and help, whatever. But
Yeah, and that's like, admittedly, that's the probably the hardest part I struggle with in both like personal relationships and business relationships is,
mm,
I tend to be pretty demanding because my whole life is about problem solving
mm-hmm,
and it's about making failures, improving.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so I expect it of myself, and inherently I expect that of others. But it definitely is hard for people to perceive that it's like I absolutely love you the way you are, or
mm-hmm,
else I wouldn't have you as part of this company,
mm-hmm.
um, or as a relationship in my life. But at the same time, I want you to feel happy about stuff you accomplish.
Right.
And I haven't found the balance.
Well, but I think that
I've
you've done a pretty good, I mean, you have with me at least, where it was like, I mean, there are a couple of things where it wasn't like huge mistakes or anything, but
mhm.
things that I needed to improve on. And I thought you were pretty gentle with it, and just,
Yeah.
where you found that tool, at least, of, like, compliment somebody, and fill them
Hmm.
up, um, at least as much as you are going to ask for improvement or correction,
Hmm.
so that then it's like, it's not like, oh, they're only ever asking, telling me I'm doing something wrong, but,
Yeah.
and you've talked about your patience that you've developed, and you've see the mistakes as actually beneficial and stuff. So I think, you're
Hmm.
doing all right.
Yeah. But
But
that's where, like, it's also helpful. We found that it's helpful to have other people who are opposite personality of me,
mm,
to where it's like, sometimes we found it helpful for certain individuals where it's like, hey, go talk to him
mm-hmm,
about like the thing you're experiencing. That way it's like you can get some really awesome positive reinforcement that isn't asking you to improve.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's like, this is always the hardest part is the things that make people strong in certain areas also are weaknesses, right?
Yeah. It can become,
So
yeah.
it's like, Steve Jobs, I think Steve Jobs is a genius when it comes to strategy. He's just hyper focused on strategically how can we accomplish this. But with that hyper focus, he in his relationships also became a jerk, because it was
Right.
like, if you're not hyper focused on the same path, screw you, kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's that balance of asking him to change or soften up in that focus. Does that hurt the stuff he's been able to accomplish? And that's always kind of
Production.
yeah, it's always that push and pull.
Yeah.
I think there's always a little bit that you can give, but it's like, I had one of our employees be like, Weston, you're always trying to solve problems. Like, could we just stop?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, part of me, as I was thinking about it, it's like, yeah, but that's why our clients love us, and that's why we are where we are, and that's why we haven't
Yeah.
fallen apart as a company, because we're constantly problem solving.
Yeah.
Do I understand the sentiment that sometimes it can feel like too much, and it's like, okay, how do I check and balance that?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, the hard part, and I don't have an answer for it, but the hard part is like, if I stopped problem solving, which would please the individual who is saying that I problem solve too much, it would also destroy all the things that they enjoyed about working here as a company and the progress that they've seen and stuff like that. And so it's always that balance.
Yeah, definitely. And trying to find kind of the sweet spot there. But
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there are ways to find it. But it just like you said, it's just a process that and some of that is just relationship development, and you're kind of learning, well, maybe with this specific person, I can take a little bit different approach or whatever. But
and what we implemented, I mean, this is kind of a little more on the business side. What we implemented was, I hate the idea of like human resources HR departments, because most of them are just pathetic. Most of them, they hired just like some random person, and it's like, oh, here's some dude from IT department, he's going to be HR. It's like, okay, you get the most unsociable person in the world to be in charge of your HR. But then also a lot of times it's like, here's someone that you can go complain to, and then it's like nothing happens, but you vent, right?
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, in my mind, that's the wrong philosophy, because then you're allowing basically just people to be complaining about stuff but never finding the solution.
Right.
And so it's like, we implemented it in our company where we encourage, and most of the people on our team do a pretty good job of, if they have a problem, they'll approach the person they have a problem with. And that's just kind of through hiring people and hiring the right people. But when the occasion does arise that someone doesn't quite know how to resolve a problem or a conflict they're having with someone, we have what would be kind of like an HR department. We have a few individuals who you can go to get suggestions on how to solve the problem. So it's like, it's still on you as the employee to solve it with your coworker. But we have some resources for you to, we have some support to be like, hey, here's the situation. Oh, that's horrible that you're feeling that way. What about this and this and this and this and this? What do you think about trying this? Okay, well, let me go try. Right.
Right. Interesting.
And so it's like, empowering people. And that's kind of what we found is, even for myself, like, as I struggle with these things that are, both a benefit for running a successful film production company, but sometimes can be difficult on the relationship side.
Yeah.
It's like having those outside perspectives that I can go to, or employees can go to navigate ways to, see it from other people's understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's always kind of has been a balance as well, where you're just in relationships, and probably business relationships might be a little bit different. There's just an added element there, but where it's like, for one thing, I think oftentimes people do just need to be heard and validated for their frustration, and then they can just let it go. And there's incredible value there, but then that can also lead to, where maybe they're not actually letting it go, but they're just
it's unprocessed.
Right, it's unprocessed, and that they might be even sometimes it becomes commiseration rather than processing or validating or whatever, because it's like so that is kind of a fine line as well. Like even in relationships I've found where outside of a workplace, it's like I want to sometimes I do just, in fact, a lot of times I just want to be heard and have my frustrations validated, and then I can kind of have that support. But then I've experienced quite often where it's like, they're like, yeah, this person is stupid, or this is, that's awful. And then and then they get frustrated by it just as much as I was. And then it just, because you kind of like feed off of each other. And then it just actually makes the problem even worse rather than like actually processing it and kind of letting it go. So it's kind of a balance, I think, that we have to learn how to do.
Yeah. And I think it kind of goes back to the same idea. It's like, give yourself time to process it.
Yeah.
Whether that's through you processing it yourself, don't take it in the moment, think about it, but also, your dealings with, that's what we encourage our team members, in those dealings, take time to process it. And I mean, I guess in the attempt to sum it up in a theme, it's like, that's really, the concept behind shop blocking, taking time to process it. And also the concept behind, any of the elements that we do in training or things like that, it's giving time to process.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how I would sum it up. It's just like,
back. Yeah.
Take a step back, allow time to process. And that's the best way to develop a successful company, like successful production, successful relationships. And I'd say even like successful mental aptitude is allow yourself time to process it.
Yeah.
Kind of don't just do it in the moment.
Right. Yeah. Take the time you need to kind of distance yourself from the emotion of the moment and be able to process it, and then work through it and make a decision that's actually going to be the most healthy or productive eventually, once you're able to process it all. That's interesting.
Yeah. And that's kind of, and that's what I learned talking to you. I didn't quite attach those two together before, but I think it's wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So just maybe one or two questions here to wrap up. I was curious about what has been your favorite, well, I don't know if I want to like necessarily make you talk about specific projects if you don't, if you want to rate them, but I just one of your favorite experiences, whether it be from a project or something like that you've had since you've been doing film over these years.
I mean, the things that bring me the most joy are seeing like team members really shine in their ability. And so, we have a feature film that it's a sci-fi feature film that we had started production on in 2016. And it was kind of our first foray into feature films. And then we kind of had to put it on pause because it cost so much and we had to go find a way to make money and pay everybody.
Yeah.
But working on the first part of that film, it was awesome to see team members just like take on their element in ways that I hadn't seen them before, and just kind of be like blown away with like, oh wow, like you just went all out on that art design, and it's without doubt the best thing I've seen you do, and you didn't feel burdened by it, where sometimes doing client projects you feel like kind of burdened because you're trying to do something. And then you've got someone being like, oh, but the colors don't match what we're trying to,
right.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so that was probably, still to date, that project, plus like little elements. I think in every commercial project, there's always a point where one person kind of does something above and beyond. And it's like, wow, like that is awesome.
Yeah.
And that's always just really inspiring. I mean, in the end, for me, I think being a solo filmmaker is the worst thing, because I can only do so much as a solo filmmaker.
Yeah.
And it's like being able to have, other creative people complement my vision and bring it to life is just the most inspiring thing, not only because my vision becomes so much better than what it could have been if I had done it alone, but also it's just really cool to see people feel good about their talents and kind of come to realize that. So yeah, those, that's probably what is the most standout moments for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that definitely one of the bigger lessons I learned on our production was that it takes a team to make a good product, and
yeah,
you've got to have a good support system there.
And just passion.
Yeah, and having that vision is what kind of I think inspires that passion.
To tie all the passions together, because passions can be erroneous and just like all over the place, and it's like, oh wow, you made a pile of nothing.
Right. Yeah.
But if you have that vision to take all those passions, merge them,
pull them together. Okay, one last thing. I was curious. So if you were to give advice to an aspiring filmmaker out there who's just really interested, passionate about whether they be young or old or whatever, they haven't done much, or maybe they've done a little, but they don't really know maybe the steps to move forward or where to start, or to go from wherever they are, what would be kind of your initial just response, starting point for somebody who wants to do what you do?
That's a wonderful question. My immediate thought goes back to what we talked about, the shot blocking and live action storyboarding. Find ways to make mistakes early and often. Probably an example that I learned that was really helpful to me is like, if you're on a street and you've got 10 stoplights, do you wait for all 10 stoplights to turn green before you start moving? Right. Or do you wait for just the one right in front of you to turn green? Yeah. And that's kind of, for me, it's like I get nervous about working on these projects worth tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And my way to counteract that nervousness is, what's the simplest thing that I can do right now? Okay, cool. Like, we have the script done. Or, maybe even the script is a hard thing to do. So it's like, okay, the outline. So it's like, what's the simplest thing I can do right now? Or it's like, okay, filming is so daunting and getting actors is so daunting. It's like, okay, cool. I've got my best friend. Let me ask him to come stand in front of the camera and we'll do some shot blocking. And it's like, all of a sudden, like, the fear starts melting away. And by the time you get to the production, it's like the fear's gone. And it's like, oh, this all just makes sense. And it was so much easier than I thought it would be, to a degree.
Yeah.
So it's like, find those ways just to start moving. And the second thing would be, along that side, like, be patient. Like, I made the mistake of comparing myself to, like, Hollywood directors. And it's like, those guys are like 50 and 60 years old.
Right.
Like, they've been doing it for so long that it's when I'm, 20 years old and I was worrying about how I could film a movie like Ridley Scott. It's like, well, don't worry about it.
Right.
You don't have to right now. Like, Ridley Scott's not going to call you up tomorrow and be like, hey, I need you to take over my next film.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's like, kind of going back to that same thing of like, you're perfectly fine the way you are, but keep improving. It's the same thing as like, you're perfectly fine as a filmmaker, but just keep improving, but be patient with yourself and set reasonable expectations. Yeah. Or else the fear will just take over and you'll be like, oh, I'm not like Ridley Scott yet, so
I quit.
I quit, or I'm not gonna, shoot this commercial.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, the only way Ridley Scott became the way he did is because he shot, thousands of commercials.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. There's a quote that I love by Marie Forleo where she says, the key to success, I think, is the key to success is to start before you're ready. Right. So you're just kind of starting where you are, wherever you are.
Because you'll never be ready. Right.
Right. Totally.
And that's the benefit of life, of pushing and finding good people to help you push. Yeah. And that's kind of the biggest thing. And that'd be probably my third suggestion is, always be on the lookout for who's that person who can help you. It takes time to find the right person. And in my opinion, you have to be picky, because if I just hired, anybody, I would not have a very powerful team.
Right.
But I always communicated what I was doing. everybody knew Weston's, the filmmaking guy.
Yeah.
And then people start getting attracted to it. And you find some people who are like, oh, dude, I want to make films. Can I be your editor? And it's like, have you ever edited? And they're like, no. And it's like, okay, well, do you want to try? No. And then it's like, okay, well, that's not really the right person.
Right.
But then other people, it's like you notice their talents and you're like, hey, dude, you're really good at, these, that's how we found our writer, Jacob. It was like, wow, dude, your poems are crazy and these short stories are amazing. Have you ever thought of writing, a movie? No, never thought about that. You want to try? Yeah, sure. And it's like, then you kind of test it and you figure out like, wow, this. And now, I mean, our stories are amazing and it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with our writing team coming up with these phenomenal ideas. So like, that's the third thing is like, always be on the lookout for additional talent.
Yeah.
But don't be desperate for additional talent.
Yeah.
Because if you get desperate, you just get a bunch of losers
right.
who won't help you.
Yeah, that's a fine distinction, but that's I love that. The team is going to be everything when it comes to finally putting things together, and it's going to make all the difference in the world. That's awesome. Well, that is fantastic. What a great conversation, and I think
thanks, man.
So valuable to anyone who's interested in this, or even just life or relationships. We touched on a lot of things there. So where can people find you or find anything about what you're doing? I know that you were doing a what's it called, like a course and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we have weekly bonus features, typically about our productions. We're kind of on a little pause right now, but it will be resuming shortly. And that can be found on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/COMV Productions, that's COM as in Mary, V as in Victor Productions. And that'll be, all of our behind the scenes of kind of how we do stuff. We talk about a lot of these principles and we share these principles. And then we have a course at filmmakerskit.com.
Okay.
And that's where we're launching, various kind of more, some of it's business oriented courses on filmmaking. We realize there's not a lot of good courses that speak sense into like, hey, here's actual numbers that you can use on actual productions. Yeah. And then also with that, we have various courses that focus on, in production type of stuff. We found that a lot of education tends to be like aftermath, where it's like, hey, 10 years ago I did this and I'm gonna tell you about it, versus like in the moment. And so a lot of it's, on set type footage, and you see us making mistakes and learning from those mistakes in the moment on an actual set. And then we have various interviews and stuff that pick apart what those lessons were. And in the end, we feel like it's a much better way to become educated, because oftentimes when people talk about their mistakes as like far removed, it still doesn't feel like that's applicable to me. Right. And so we try to teach education in a way where it's like, no, like, this is $1 million project that we made this mistake on. Yeah. Real time, real world. Yeah. And it's like, don't feel bad about this mistake when you make it on your own set, but let's figure out how we can solve that mistake. Yeah. So that's awesome. So that's filmmakerskit.com. Okay. And I'll put all that in the show notes and the description and everything, so that we can get people over there, because I think you're a wealth of knowledge, and anyone who is interested in filmmaking, it would benefit greatly from what you're doing. So cool. Well, thanks, man. Hey, it was a pleasure talking with you. Oh, you too. Thanks for coming on, Weston. Thank you so much for watching. It seriously means a lot. If you like that video and you want to see more like it, you can find them by clicking on the link right over there.